Many thanks. First of all, it's terrific to see all of you here. Many thanks to our hosts, Mary Watson and Pam Tillis of the New School and their team. Louder? The New School always makes the nation feel welcome. We value this partnership. So just when you thought this election could not get more bizarre, surreal, ugly, toxic. So we gather here, you've seen the title of this panel. More than in any recent presidential campaign, the role of the media has rightly become a central consuming issue in the 2016 campaign. In March of this year, I wrote a Washington Post column called Media Malpractice that's hurting everyone but Trump. And I think you'd agree that until these last few months, Trump was given free, uncritical, unfiltered access to TV, cable media outlets. His rise abetted by a clickbait, ratings, and profit-obsessed TV news media. The Trump spectacle, and I'm sure we'll talk about this tonight, not only overshadowed other candidates, it also drowned out much-needed conversation and attention to issues of vital importance. And I think we saw another kind of media malpractice in how Bernie Sanders' campaign and issues were covered or not covered, for too long virtually ignored, marginalized. And while in 2008 the media were rightly focused on the historic implications of the first African-American president, 8 years later, the significance of the country's first woman president seemed to be discounted. I have to think that's partly because too much of the media, whether it's misogyny or ignorance, failed or refused to recognize this profound moment for equality and basic dignity of half of our nation's population. If there's any upside to Trump's rampant misogyny, it opened needed conversations about media coverage and treatment of sexual assault and harassment. And we got feminist memes like nasty women get it done that give us a platform for conversations about serious issues that affect women. Now, I didn't take this campaign to confirm we need more media watchdogs, fewer lapdogs, and watchdogs who challenge and hold accountable the powerful interests wherever they may be. At The Nation, we don't think, quote, post-truth politics began with Trump. We remember Joe McCarthy and his lies, and we remember when journalists became cheerleaders for the Iraq War, suspending skepticism and scrutiny. But even with historical perspective, this media moment is particularly fraught and dangerous. For one, as The Nation has for years reported on, I'm sure we'll talk about, we're witnessing corrosive structural changes that have made traditional media less capable of calling out irresponsible demagogic candidates and campaigns. Think of the death of daily papers, for one, and the conglomeratization, Murdochization, Breitbartization, alt-rightization that we are witnessing. So I think tonight, I hope we'll talk about how we craft a media system that goes beyond personality, trivia, and titillation to talk about the many deeper issues that demand attention. And how do we address the growing and cultivated, I would argue, distrust of the media? I don't think it's about right or left. I think it's about a corporatized media system that fails to cover issues of importance to millions of people. Let me just close. I mean, I think Trump's 2016 campaign is going to preoccupy historians and media critics for years to come. While a number of factors contributed to his rise, it's not just the media, you know, that latent and open racism, nativism, misogyny, legitimate economic anxiety, resulting from both Republican and Democratic elites and administrations. So we hold this event because we believe the media deserves special scrutiny. It sets agendas, shapes perceptions, and wields one of the greatest forms of political power. That is the power to decide what is and what is not part of the national conversation. So you have here with you a panel, a wonderful, extraordinary panel, ready to discuss these issues. And in these last days, if we've been consumed with FBI overreach, WikiLeaks, emails, leaks, I would argue that there's another event that demands our attention, a media event. I'd suggest that the one element of post-election soul-searching in newsrooms and boardrooms is about a structural overhaul of our media system. It's not so sexy, but it's vital. As the proposed, I'm sure you followed Time Warner, AT&T merger announced only a week or so ago makes clear we need a revitalized antitrust politics. We need a media and democracy reform movement. We need grassroots support, and we need structural alternatives to this corporate media. And that's just one of several reasons why this evening is so important, and I can't think of anyone better to guide us than Laura Flanders. All of you know Laura. She is someone who is an extraordinary force across all platforms. She was just telling me that Facebook Live is what so many people are watching, but she does it so well, and she has her own show, seen weekly on KCET, Link TV, Free Speech TV, and in English and Spanish in Telesur. She is a contributing, cherished writer to The Nation, and she is a regular guest on MSNBC, author of 6 books, Blue Grit, Bushwoman, Tales of a Cynical Species, a particular favorite. And I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and thank you very much for coming tonight.
Gosh, well, I hope we're not going to get totally beyond personality trivia and titillation, because really, how much fun would be left then? I'm excited to be here today and to have this conversation. And we get to have a conversation that I think is a little different from what you might be hearing elsewhere. If we were simply to be having a conversation about how, I don't know, pussy grabbing is wrong, then there'd be no point us really coming out tonight. Here at The Nation, I think we can afford to be a little bit more forward-looking than that, and talk a little bit about not just the lessons of this election and its coverage, but what we all would like to see in the future from our media and from one another. I have some ideas of how we will start with that conversation, but I want to begin, if I can unlock my phone, by introducing our panelists tonight, who really, as Katrina said, there's nobody better for discussing this topic. We have Rinku Sen, who is the President and Executive Director of Race Forward, the Center for Racial Justice Innovation, and the publisher of the award-winning news site Color Lines. If you don't know Rinku's work, you surely must, you surely should. Farai Chideya is a senior writer for 538, where I joked with her in the green room that she's really been putting us all to shame because she's actually been out there reporting on the demographic changes that this election is tracking. She's worked for years in print and television, radio, digital media. She's covered every election since 1996. Katha Pollitt, Nation columnist, no stranger to this crowd, prize-winning poet and author. Her most recent book is Pro, Reclaiming Abortion Rights. The New York Times called it a notable book of 2014. And Joan Walsh, the Nation's national affairs correspondent and MSNBC political analyst, longtime writer and editor, and the author most recently of What's the Matter with White People? Finding Our Way in the Next America. So let's start with where we sometimes end in these conversations, and that is how all of this looks to the world. I was struck this morning that I listened to the news, the US news, and you know what that was about, and then I listened to the BBC. And on the BBC, I heard a woman in Mosul talk about how she had lived for 3 years afraid to go out, because women living under IS control in Mosul were afraid that if they didn't obey some stricture of IS, they would be decapitated. And I thought, okay, well, if we're going to talk about misogyny, let's start there. And let's start with remembering that all the women in the world are not in the United States, and that this election holds in its hands the fate of many more than just us. So I'm jumping this on you a little bit, and I'm sorry to do that, but you're all up for it. Those women, how would they, what would be the malpractices they would lift up, do you think, first and foremost?
That we're not talking about them in our political discourse at all. I mean, the networks, we've now learned that the largest single political 2016 election topic that the 3 big networks have covered is Hillary Clinton's emails. So they would be very disappointed in us, as we should be in ourselves.
Rinku, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, this cycle has not focused a lot on issues in general, neither from the candidates nor from the news coverage. And so when we talk about the foreign policy inclinations of Trump or Clinton, or when we talk about their positions with regard to choice or abortion. Those discussions have been so minimal, so flashing, that there hasn't been much space to dig into, well, who is actually, so if we had a foreign policy that looked this way versus a foreign policy that looked this way, how would various sets of people be affected by that? So, so I think whether the discussion is about a nominally gendered issue, like reproductive rights, or about something that seems ungendered, like war, then the gender implications of both sets are, neither one gets much depth of coverage nor much depth of discussion by the certainly the presidential campaigns. So yeah, I think Joan is right that women around the world would be mystified and disappointed, and a lot of their counterparts here in the States, their family members, their community members, because of course there are people in the US voting from all over the world. I mean citizens of the US voting, but who are from all over the world. Nobody asks them either, or us either. So I just think that the general lack of substance in this presidential election cycle has worked against women both domestically and globally.
Katha, you in your most recent piece reminded us that women have been rising up on behalf of their own rights and in defense of their own rights around the world in different places. We don't get to hear much from them either.
Well, it is an American election. I wouldn't expect the Irish, who are, working so hard to overturn the Eighth Amendment to the Irish Constitution, which places the fetus and the woman as equal, having equal rights. I wouldn't expect them to play a big role in our election. But I would expect that reproductive rights and other women's rights would play a larger role in our election. And it's just amazing to me how substanceless, even these debates that all seem to be about a substantial issue, where for once, the question isn't, Hillary, why do so many people dislike you? And Donald, what's with your hair? Even there, it's all so so thin and so narrow. And women, reproductive rights people have been trying in every conceivable way to force into the debate a question about reproductive rights. And they're tweeting and writing and, blogging, making a huge fuss. And finally, there it was, my God, and Hillary gave, I thought, a really great answer. I thought it was perfect. And Donald Trump gave his bumbling and terrible answer. And I've even wondered if the reason why there is so little content, policy content in the whole discussion is that, let's say there was, what would Donald Trump say? He doesn't know anything. He didn't even know what a nuclear triad is. And I found out.
You Googled it?
I looked it up. I mean, he is totally ignorant. And it's shocking. And maybe if that had been brought out, I don't know, maybe that would have won him votes the way things are going. But we're knowing something in the case of Hillary Clinton turns out to be a demerit. Oh, my goodness, she's so wonky. Isn't it terrible to actually know something? But anyway, one candidate really, whatever you think of her politically, she would not be saying, like Gary Johnson, who is looking to get maybe 7% of the vote, what is Aleppo? The level of discourse is just staggeringly foolish and stupid. It drives me wild. I'll be quiet now.
Farai, do you have a favorite media malpractice that you want to lift up or respond to this question around international perspective?
For me, the international perspective thing is sort of going with what Katha said. There are certain things that I wouldn't expect an international audience to want to know about this election. But what I've been struck by doing interviews with various international outlets is that the international journalists usually ask better questions.
Yes.
Because they're boiling it down to, okay, this is another country that could severely impact our country if they go crazy. So what do we need to know about how these people are thinking? And so probably if that woman in Mosul has a hand crank radio, whatever's on it, if she can get a credible journalistic source, is probably better than what we're getting, honestly. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Generally, and I'll go into this more later, I've been tracking media coverage using different, basically, there's been some really good actual study of what's been happening in this election, and the Shorenstein Center in particular has been doing great work and essentially found that Trump got a free pass until Super Tuesday. And so, for example, they looked at 8 critical news outlets, and in 2015, in the ramp up to this election, Trump's coverage was neutral or positive 63% of the time in the New York Times, which is the lowest percentage, and 74% in USA Today, the highest. And Trump and the Republicans got the lion's share of the news coverage. And so essentially, there's this critical window, not just during the sort of formal primary season, but in the lead up to the primaries in 2015, in the year before the election, where people are making up their minds about who's viable and who's insane, et cetera, et cetera. And we just failed, we as the media failed the public. And we were obsessed with, I mean, I'm using the broad media we, I don't think any of us have been big contributors or contributors at all to this syndrome, but the big media we has really failed the American public during that critical evaluation and decision-making phase in 2015 and all the way up to Super Tuesday in 2016. And I'm going to do a project looking at the race and gender of the American political core and how and whether that affected that coverage, because I also really feel that the race and gender of the people who are in newsrooms, not just the reporters, but the editors and the publishers, has made a huge impact, because a lot of people I know who were journalists of color, for example, were saying that we needed to be more investigative about Donald Trump. Donald Trump wasn't born yesterday. He's a man who we know about his comments about the Central Park Five. We know about, we've known about this man for quite a while. So I don't know why people were so surprised that he showed his colors.
Rinku, picking up on what Farai just talked about, there are significant demographic shifts happening outside of the newsroom that are being felt in this election more than any other so far. Can you just give us some sense of what those are and the significance of those? Because it's also against that backdrop that our policy-less reporting has happened.
So actually, the thing that I thought I would bring into this conversation, I'm sure I've been driven mad by all of the things the three of you have been driven mad by, but one thing in particular that's been getting to me is the media's tripping around the words majority and minority because of the fact of changing demographics. So the country's going to be mostly people of color. There was a headline that I read from a couple of days ago that said, minority babies now the majority of infants born. So that majority, I read another headline that Bellevue, Washington is now the biggest majority minority city in Washington state. So I just want us to take the majority-minority thing and look at it for a second, because it's been there since I arrived in the country in 1972, so I know for at least 45 years that's the way we've been talking about white people and people of color. And what happens is that we say, so I Googled this morning, majority elections and minority elections. So when you Google majority and elections, what comes up, and US, what comes up is sources about majority versus pluralistic rule. So, majority rule government versus proportional representation government, which I wish we had. But when you Google minority in elections, what comes up is a bunch of stories about people of color. So there's a way in which we think of Americans as white. Every time we say majority and we mean white, then we reinforce that American equals white. And every time we say minority and we actually mean a group of color, usually we only mean African Americans and Latinos. We don't mean Asians. We don't mean Native people. We don't mean Arabs. So, we have a very narrow swath of people of color who are included in a minority, but minorities get specified, but white people get to be Americans, even when you use the majority and minority language. And we're twisting ourselves into these word pretzels, or twisting out these word pretzels like majority, minority, which makes no sense anywhere. Mostly, I think, because the media still does not know how to say on the regular white people and African Americans and Latinos and Asians, and to take all those different kinds of people of color apart to disaggregate us is too much trouble. And so we have lots of stories in this cycle about how Black voters and Latino voters are worried about the election and are, leaning Democrat. But we have almost nothing about Asian voters, Native voters, nothing about voter suppression in those communities. We assume that all Asian voters are, Ivy League sending wealthy people who don't like affirmative action for somebody else. But in fact, there's a huge range of economic and immigration and other education, other conditions among Asian communities and Asian voters. So majority and minority, because the press can't come out of that framework, but also doesn't care really to examine its practice in relation to that framework, we're going to have increasingly confused reporting and a lot of non-reporting on communities of color, and as well as on various kinds of white communities, because they're not monolithic either, right? We're going to have very confused reporting because we can't even call people by how they identify themselves. And we're in a majority-minority framework that is no longer reality. So haven't caught up to the reality. And we keep projecting that it's going to happen, next generation, but it's happened in much of the country already. And I think the press has a lot of work to do to catch up with that.
Joan, if the Obama election is anything to go by, we will likely see polarization around the quote-unquote woman question, which continues to be a sort of white idea, but the woman question, get worse if there's a Hillary Clinton presidency. This doesn't end. Our long national nightmare does not come to an end next Tuesday. How do you see that playing out, and are there steps that you are thinking of taking as a journalist to help us head some of this off at the pass, or, I don't know, inoculate ourselves or something?
There's no inoculation. The only way around it is through it. I hope to take a vacation and detox at some point. I don't know when that will be. But, I think that for a lot of women, this entire election has been very painful and kind of unsettling because there's such blatant misogyny, not just against Hillary Clinton, certainly against her, but, I think about when Donald Trump talked about Megyn Kelly with blood coming out of her wherever, and I spent that weekend feeling like, my God, you're Megyn Kelly, you're at the pinnacle of right-wing television, you're very accomplished, you're very smart, and someone is still saying this about you. And we've just had week after week of shocking and horrifying things from Donald Trump, but also from his supporters. And I think that there's really, Vox had an interesting piece today, but, again, your attitudes about race heavily determine whether you support Donald Trump, but your attitude's about gender too. So we will have a backlash. We're already having a backlash. And I think the only thing that I know to do about it is to talk about it and to call it out when we see it. And to know it's there and not to be made crazy like, oh, you're just imagining it. Why are you so sensitive? But I would say one positive thing is that, and I wonder if others agree with me. Maybe I'm being too positive, but I think that some men on the left have gotten it a little bit better in the last few months. I really do. I've had more conversations where they seem to be really taking it in. Just the kind of abuse, for example, that women take on social media, where a male Democrat or a male progressive certainly gets in lots of arguments, but a woman is immediately told she's ugly, she's stupid, she's fat, she's old, she should be raped. It gets worse from there. But I feel like the ugliness that this election has brought out has enlightened some men. So that's my hope. Anyone else agree with me?
Well, I don't know about the enlightenment. I think the jury's out on that. I think individual men have improved, but then there are all these other men who used to be quiet and now they're here.
Very loud.
Yeah. So I don't know if you add it all up. We'll have to ask 538 to do a numerical study of all this. But I try to tell myself when I'm saying the things to myself that Joan was saying before she got optimistic. She went all optimistic on me.
Sorry.
That there's a big story and there's a less big story. And really, the country is full of maniacs and horrible people of every stripe. And they come out in a political campaign, especially one as contentious as this one. But the big story is that barring, Kinahora, we're going to have a woman president. A woman is going to be the most powerful person in the world. And she's not the only powerful woman now. There are a number of other ones, like Angela Merkel and some of those other women whose name I can't remember. Angela Merkel.
Theresa May,
Yeah.
Christine
And
Lagarde.
I'm not saying that they're necessarily good or better than some other politician, male or female, but I just think the important thing is that we'll have a woman president. We'll probably have more women in Congress than before, and that little by little, and the terrible thing is it takes so long to make even these modest gains, but I think, women are on the upsurge in a slow and steady kind of a way, so that's really great.
Well, you made the point in the column that I was thinking about the other day, about why hasn't this been a bigger story?
Yeah.
Right.
Why hasn't it? Katha?
Why hasn't what been a bigger story?
The sort of
The
ceiling
women's
breaking
uprising.
phenomenon of
For all the usual reasons. It's because it's women and women don't count, and I think women don't always maximize their political power. I mean, this piece that that Laura's referring to is this one called "The Pussy Grabs Back," which was unfortunately illustrated with this picture online. If you look it up, it's this kitten. And the kitten looks very worried. Instead of like a ferocious tiger, it's the kitten going, But it does begin with stories of women where women have been very politically, through self-organization, have been very important. One of them is the case of Ireland, and another is Poland. I mean, in Poland, just a month ago, it was incredible. The horrible right-wing government, which is has to do lots of favors for the Catholic Church, was prepared to make abortion completely illegal. And women went on a work strike. There were demonstrations all over. They walked out of church. They wore black. They did all kinds of things. And the government backed down. They may come back, but they really showed that they cared, as it were. Then looking back in Liberia, there was remember that wonderful movie, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, where Muslim and Christian women got together. My God, we've had the civil war for a long time. We've got to do something about it. And they forced peace, and now there's a woman president in Liberia. So I guess I still have that, I don't know, some people would say second wave feminist hope, although I'm too young to actually have been in the second wave, that when women organize on their own behalf, really good things can happen. And that's what they don't do enough of. How any woman could be voting for Trump, I mean, somebody said today, when there's the category of the self-hating Jew, and that is often deployed against Jews who are, in favor of Palestinian rights or are insufficiently pro-Israel. But, I think there are a lot of women who just don't, who are self-hating. I can't explain it some other way, how they can put up with this. It shocks me.
Rinku, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think that the uprising among women is amazing worldwide. I have actually two thoughts I want to say, so cut me off if you need to. But I think that most reporters and editors don't know anything about organizing or about power building, and they don't think that those are stories. So what they'll end up covering is what happened to X piece of legislation, whether it passed or didn't, but they don't know how to dig up the story of the organizing, whether it wins or loses. And I believe they don't think it's interesting to readers, that readers don't want those kinds of process stories. And journalists think of them as like feel-good solution stories. They can't see the tension in those stories and figure out how to write about them in the ways that we all do. And so that's one thought. And I think that the race-gender combo here is that a lot of that leadership is happening out of communities of color. So when I think about the young women who are organizing to end rape culture and who they are, so many of them are women of color, and so much of that work is happening in communities of color. But if you're a news outlet and you don't have many reporters of color, or at least none that grew up in communities of color and have relationships in communities of color, then it's really easy to miss those stories. And it tends to be former organizers like myself who move into journalism with all of those contacts, rolling along, who can move those stories. So the other thought I was having is that, so I work in a racial justice organization. We produce journalism and media, but we also do research, and we also support through practice programs people who are doing work on the ground. We have some firewalls in between those different functions. But after Obama was elected, the big news in the country was that now we're post-racial, right? So the conservatives, the race conservatives, didn't push that so hard before he got elected because they didn't want him to be elected. So they wouldn't say if he gets elected, that will prove that we are now post-racial. But he gets elected, and then, for weeks, there's a drumbeat over how racism now no longer exists. And part of the reason it's possible to say that is that most Americans, and I include the media in this, they define racism in 1950s ways. It's individual, overt, intentional, animus-driven discrimination. And the idea that there's such a thing as systemic racism that doesn't actually require any individual animus, and that a whole bunch of good liberal white people or even good liberal people of color could be running, that because of its race blindness will continue to do racial harm, that was a whole how to define racism pivot that we had to do. And frankly, over the last 8 years, I think we've made a lot of progress on that. That is what I see is going to need to happen on the gender front. We're going to have, on November 9th, or starting at 11 p.m., November 8th, we're going to have everybody saying, now we're post-sexism, we're post... They don't use the word patriarchy in the mainstream media, so they'll just say we're post-sexist now. It's a post-gender world. No more glass ceiling. Don't have to worry about it. And it's going to be up to organizers and journalists and pundits, public intellectuals, to define sexism properly in that moment and for the coming period, because it's going to get horrible. It's going to get horrible. People, justify a lot of terrible behavior with, like, now we're post-racial, so I can do whatever I want or say whatever
Well, you were quoted in the Times, Rinku, as sort of cheering, and maybe it was an inner cheer when you heard Hillary Clinton use the word implicit racism. And just to remind us, I mean, how long would you say it took for that language to make it into her
I would
lexicon?
say, I mean, the racial justice groups have been working on getting systemic racism and implicit bias into the mainstream discourse for, I would say, a solid 10 years. And I'm talking about those particular phrases and ideas. I mean, obviously, we worked on racism before that. But really focusing on trying to get that redefinition and get unconscious bias into the mix. For 10 years. And the racial conservatives hate systemic bias, systemic racism. They'll admit that there's racism, but they just don't want you to ever call it systemic racism and therefore start proposing like really fundamental systemic changes.
Well, and the court has been very clear in rejecting appeals and class action suits on that basis. I mean, they still have a very kind of burning tire bar for racism. Has this election and the coverage thereof, which is to say the behavior of Donald Trump, helped or hindered our ability to get a more sophisticated view of sexism and misogyny? Farai, Joan, Katha?
I don't think you have to be, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead,
you
please.
go.
No.
I don't think you have to be very sophisticated to be offended by the naked misogyny of the Donald Trump campaign. I mean, when somebody wears a shirt that says,
Right.
Trump the bitch, or even worse words.
Life's a bitch, don't vote for one. That was
Right,
that was a
or,
popular
yeah.
T-shirt.
Yeah, or Hillary sucks, but not like Monica.
That's my favorite.
Yeah, I don't think you have. And there was actually a story about some little kid, some little boy saying this. And his parents are, oh, that's fine.
But is that now going to be the bar for what sexism and misogyny is?
I'm just saying. I think it's going to be hard to say sexism is, on November 9th, sexism is over now because there's been such an outpouring of it, and those people are not going to disappear. They're going to be there. I think there is one thing that will happen, though, that I'd like to just mention, which is sometimes when a woman becomes very great and very acknowledged in her greatness, then every other woman who isn't quite as great is seen as more wanting than before. For example, when Marie Curie was, the hugely famous woman scientist of her day and winning the Nobel Prize and all like that, it didn't help other women scientists. The departments would say, well, she's good, but she's no Marie Curie. So it was used against women, and I think that can happen too. If Hillary Clinton is president, and then it's like, oh, well, we don't need more women in politics, we've got her. That won't be good. That won't be good at all. But I don't think that'll happen because I think Hillary is very much in favor of more women politicians, and she does show that kind of sisterhood, I believe.
All right.
Yeah, there was a study that came out that was from research conducted in June that found that sexism was the top predictive factor for Trump voters, ahead of racial animus and ahead of authoritarian attitudes. So that kind of lets you know a lot.
By what criteria did they?
Anti-racist, sexist.
Yeah,
all over that campaign.
Yeah, I mean, so it asked 4 questions. Most women interpret innocent remarks or acts as being sexist. Many women are actually seeking special favors, such as hiring practices that favor women over men, under the guise of asking for equality. Feminists are not actually seeking for women to have more power than men. Feminists are making entirely reasonable demands of men. Guess what the answers might be in either case. So that, was a simple 4-question quiz. And, just sort of to circle through some of the different things that have been said, I have a friend who's an interfaith minister, and she said something that stuck with me through this whole election season. She said, when people elected President Obama, they thought they were solving race, but instead they were making a decision to address the question of race. And Donald Trump is the end of the Obama cycle. He's like the purgative that brings out all of the bile. And she said back then, things will get worse before they get better, but this is the end of a certain cycle of sort of wanting to be immediately post-racial and then getting super racial and then getting super, super, super racial. And now hopefully, you know, we will return to some kind of common sense. And I think that we'll see a similar cycle with sexism, where it's like, well, a woman's president, how sexist can we be? Wait, we can be really sexist. We can be really, really sexist. We can be really, really, really sexist. And then hopefully out of all that thrash will come something better.
Joan?
I also think it's interesting, and we should pay attention to the fact that this strain of white nationalists, what people call the alt-right, but that's a euphemism, it's really white supremacists, white nationalists, their thinking is also incredibly patriarchal and misogynist. They not only believe that whites are superior, genetically superior to any other race, but they believe that men are superior to women, and that the way to have robust whole culture is to go backwards and take women out of the positions of power that we do that we do possess, and send women quite literally back into the home. It's really, I don't think I knew that before beginning to research these groups and also talk to some of them. I really didn't see the way those things go together. It makes sense now that I know it, but I don't know, and so I don't think that the media has been very good, with a few exceptions, and often exceptions on the left, like Mother Jones and The Nation. But Mother Jones just had a really good in-depth interview with this guy, Richard Spencer, who I spent some time with at the Republican convention. But I don't think the media in general has been able to take in this genuine rise in white people saying, well, yeah, we are the minority and we want minority rights. We're going to defend ourselves. We're downtrodden. And the extent to which that goes along with women have gotten out of their place. And so we're going to be dealing, I mean, we're all acting like Hillary Clinton is going to be elected, which I do believe, but it's been a rough few days. But even assuming that she will be, I don't think the media is prepared to grapple with the rise of these people and the way that they think and their presence in the Republican Party. I mean, I think it's going to be a really big deal for the Republican Party, how they deal with the fact that, you know, they've got I'm not going to put a number or a percentage on these people, but more than 10, maybe less than 30, but, you know, sizable, noisy, well-organized.
I keep thinking about an article that Barbara Ehrenreich published right after the attacks of 9/11. It was either in The Nation or it was in Time magazine, where she was a columnist at the time. And she said that one of the big questions we were not allowed to ask and discuss because of the very speedy cutoff of that question, why, was the question of the relationship between misogyny and the rise of extreme religion around the world and its relationship to terror. And her point was, there are ructions affecting a whole part of the world, having to do, in that case, at that moment, with globalization and neoliberalism and cultural change. And the reaction, the backlash, is being waged on women's bodies. Women of color's bodies, poor women's bodies first and foremost, but on women's bodies. And it's almost as if going back, and maybe it's just because I woke up this morning listening to that BBC report, but I keep thinking we like to separate ourselves from those people over there. But we too are going through a dramatic economic and cultural shift with respect to the US role in the world, with respect to globalization, the whole neoliberal project, ability to support rising quality of life for the majority of people. The demographic shift as well. I mean, you can keep on naming the shifts that we're going through and a rising new electorate that we've talked about. And we still haven't grappled really with how central misogyny and racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism are to that backlash moment, that sort of that tension moment. And so what I hear this conversation, it sort of keeps going back to, but we're not talking about the issues. The media is not talking about the issues because we're distracted by all the personality questions. Would it be helpful to give some media examples of how media can grapple with some of those issues? Or would it be helpful to just go back to the question of media and where are some of the most egregious media failings? Because we're having trouble focusing on the media piece because there's so much else that's horrendous going on.
Well, one thing, and this is somewhat self-serving, I admit it, but the main project I've been doing for the past 3 months is a series for 538 called The Voters. And I did 9 demographic groups in stories, plus we did 3 podcasts with Asma Khalid of NPR. And so to get to your point about Asian Americans, we didn't just do Asian Americans, we did Vietnamese Americans because they have been traditionally in the Republican camp because of anti-communist sentiment, and with generational changes and the current election, there's been an accelerated move towards the Democratic Party. And I found that getting very specific with our demographics as opposed to being vague really helped us look at the changing nature of America. And also I got to talk to real people plus use data. And there have been many people who've used that in combination, but I think that data alone, there's a book out now by Kathy O'Neill, Weapons of Math Destruction, talking about the failures of algorithms. And this is not in her book because it just came out, but right now Facebook is under investigation for using, allowing people to tag housing ads with racial preferences so that only white people, for example, might see a housing ad, which is in violation of federal law. It's okay if you tag, an ad for, I don't know, used sneakers or something, but it's not okay for housing, which is a fundamental determinant of, success and wealth building in America. But basically, long story short, data is great, but only when used appropriately. And I think that's true in journalism, it's true in commerce, it's true in government. But I do think that move to integrate data and field reporting actually has been successful for many different outlets. What I've seen that's still been kind of tragically unsuccessful most of the time is TV punditry, which I still do occasionally. I did like a lot of it in 96, and we got to talk longer and say actual things, but now it's just like, most of the time.
Joan, you're the expert.
I agree. I could not agree. I could not agree more. Yeah, I mean, the TV punditry is, I think that's where some of the worst offenders are, and the sense that Donald Trump comes from TV, that certain networks really hitched their star to his ratings. They can tell that when he's speaking, their numbers are up here, and the minute they switch to even a dumbed down panel, they lose viewers. And I think that they continued to just give him open air for way too long. And I mean, you do have some people who are admitting that now, but they, it's a little bit late. Mm-hmm. And I think that also, in terms of both more TV than print, I have been out on the trail a fair amount. Thanks to The Nation, we actually go out and do real reporting, and I love that. But, when Hillary Clinton or her surrogates give speeches, they really do talk about issues. They spend a lot of time talking about issues. But the only thing you're going to see that night on television is whether she insulted Donald Trump and, how sick a burn she got in, or whether she ignored it entirely, and then why did she ignore it? Why didn't she talk about the FBI or whatever? And so there was this asymmetrical coverage where he's just carried forever, verbatim, whatever he runs his mouth about, but she only gets coverage if she's slapping back at him. So it's even worse because not only are they not giving her as much coverage or Bernie Sanders back in the day, but they're only dealing with it when it's just shallow and controversial and insulting.
How many people even in this audience know the 2 medical conditions that Hillary Clinton has policies specifically to address on the first page of her website?
Alzheimer's.
Somebody said it.
Opioids.
Autism.
Yeah.
She has specific policy on autism and Alzheimer's.
Yeah. And
I don't think that's general knowledge. After how long has this campaign been? I mean, that's just to pick one tiny detail.
That's
what's
just
this-
the A's.
That's just the A.
What's especially irritating about this failure to cover policy is that it makes it seem as if people just support women just support Hillary Clinton because she's a woman. I have been asked so often by a particular person who likes to troll me on Twitter and Facebook. I'm still waiting for someone to give a reason to vote for Hillary except that she's a woman. So finally I wrote a piece, 12 reasons to vote for Hillary Clinton, that don't have to do with Donald Trump or that she's a woman. But it just doesn't get covered. That's what's so infuriating. If you go to her website, she has very detailed policy proposals, not just for autism and Alzheimer's, but many, many other areas of our common life. But it doesn't get covered, and so people think it doesn't exist. And that is another way that that there's a sort of gender thing, because, just today, for example, in the New York Times, there was quite an interesting piece by a black writer whose name has gone out of my head, unfortunately, saying, well, actually Donald Trump he's not so bad on black people because he understands that, Democrats don't do anything for black people, like he's going to. And I'm thinking, have you lost your mind? Yeah. But, because there's some stray sentence in there in his many ravings that, she thought was a good thing to say about black people. So, but it's sort of like if he says something that's about policy, everybody is like, oh my God, he made a policy statement. And you know what?
Or
It's not so
childcare.
terrible. Childcare.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so by the time you have dismantled his childcare proposal, that it doesn't cover men, and it, well, that was a big thing, that it's not for families, it's just for mothers, and that it would be, you'd end up paying for it yourself and all that kind of thing. It's the moment is lost. The moment has moved on. Hillary Clinton has always had a really great child care proposal, and no one was interested. Oh, that's just women. That's just women. We don't care about that.
Then we're going to go to questions from the audience, but Rinku, you wanted to...
Yeah, I think that this is a problem that I'm sure has old expressions, but in the modern era, I really think that the business of journalism, the business structures have to change if we want this stuff to change. So who's been doing good reporting on this election? The independent press, and so the independent press has to be supported, which means somebody's got to pay for subscriptions. Mm-hmm. Color Lines charges nothing. We publish for free every day on the internet, and we're still trying to train our readers to give us money.
If you figure that out, let me know.
And I
Katrina would
surely
probably like to know,
will.
too.
I believe The Nation has lost money, 99% of the years that it has been operating. And what you see in big newsrooms that I think is a loss is you don't have beat reporters anymore, and the independent press often can't afford to have beat reporters. We have general assignment reporters who chase different stories. And you don't have much local reporting anymore. So we've been talking about the presidential race, but there are a lot of super interesting, highly impactful ballot measures, local races, state races, and
12 governors.
And governors' races. And, you have to be on a local beat. You have to have actual local people. It's great that some of our outlets can send us around. I appreciate that too. But there's nothing like reporting on the town that you actually live in, and the contacts you've cultivated. And so I'm not sure what the answer is, but these problems have not been helped by the consolidation of newsrooms, by the cutting of reporters' jobs and editors' jobs. And whatever creative paths we have through new media and the internet, we need to use them to build some new business models that can help us have the right kind of reporting happening, reporting by people who didn't just come out of elite college journalism programs. Most of the staff at Color Lines, their first their first journalistic jobs was like as an intern at their daily paper, at the local daily paper. So we don't have that as a pathway for women and people of color.
We have internships at the Nation.
There you go.
We have a lot of questions from all of you, and many of them have to do with the business of journalism. So I really think this is getting across loud and clear. Before we do any of that, I want to go back to movement and movement building and just share with you some information about stuff that is happening this week, because I was asked to do that, and I am supportive of the cause. So the folks who have been doing some of the demonstrations outside of Trump Tower, GOP Hands Off Me, and the Pussy Fights Back crowd, Grabs Back crowd, are taking to the streets again, they say, to bury the politics of racism, sexism, and misogyny. I can only imagine that there might be street theater involved. On November 3rd, you got your pencils out? Day after tomorrow, they're going to be assembling at Trump Tower, 725 Fifth Avenue at 4:30. Shall I repeat that? Because I didn't see many of you writing it down. November 3rd, 725 Fifth at 4:30. Women of color in leadership will be coming to demonstrate their power and defeat Trump and the GOP's politics of hate at the ballot. They then have a plan also in the first 100 hours after the election. They're going to come back to the streets. So I really encourage you all, if you want to play a role in the movements that Rinku and the others have been alluding to that do not stop on election night and that can do the job or advance the work of identifying and talking about the intersectional nature of racism, misogyny, sexism, classism, you name it. Check out Vision for Black Lives, and the group that's organizing this, or is part of a coalition, is called GOP Hands Off Me. That's the Twitter handle, GOP Hands Off Me. I hope to see you all in the streets. All right. I can do that because I don't work for a network or anything like that. I just work for myself. The American media, unlike the BBC, is profit-driven, where ratings and advertisers are important. I personally think that's when we made the news become a profit center in the first Gulf War. That's when we all went to hell, and we got Trump. But the questioner says, how much has the need to keep the election close, to keep ratings high, has driven the anti-Clinton and Trump-neutral media coverage? So how much is all of this an effort to kind of keep people watching? And I'm just going to read out a few questions because they're comparable. Is a free press conceivable? What would constitute a free press? And then, wait, there was another structural one. Oh, how do we reinvigorate labor journalism? So 3 different things. One is that question of for-profit media. Can we think of other revenue streams? What would a free press actually be? And how would all of that relate to labor journalism, given that many of our struggles are boss against worker, and the bosses own the media?
Well, I mean, I think that the profit, I worked for ABC News briefly, and I worked for CNN before its absorption into Time Warner, and then I worked for ABC, I think, right during its absorption into Disney. And one of the things that happened is that news can actually make money, but it was at the time of these mergers making about 7% profit, and entertainment divisions were making like 25-30% profit. So if you can have a profit-driven media if you take a narrow margin, and that's acceptable. But there was a whole idea that there had to be vast sums of money that were profitable. So I don't think we should give up on profit per se or earnings per se, even for nonprofit media. I think that you can have both nonprofit and for-profit media that respect that media is not going to make a ton of money. And sometimes it might lose and sometimes it might gain, but that the margins are going to be narrow if you do good journalism. Because out of that leap to expecting 25% profits, you had shutdown of bureaus worldwide, which is still continuing. Like it went from, we have, Beijing and Tokyo and, Korea, to we have the Asia producer. One of my friends was an Asia producer for a network. Asia is so small, you can fit it in a teacup, And that mentality also is, I think that first of all, technology, we have to understand what technology can and can't do. Technology should be used to supplement on-the-ground reporting and connect reporters on the ground, not to get rid of them. So I think that, to me, envisioning a media that does good journalism means also respecting people on the ground. And one of the reasons we saw the rise of Donald Trump is because people in Trump country, which I have visited, I mean, I'm using that as a broad geolocator, but Trump-intensive supporter bases, they've been undercovered. You know, like you were saying, the local newspaper shutting down. There's so many people. I went to Warren, Ohio, in that region, and there's so many people. There's an independent news organization there, The Vindicator, Vindy.com, and they do really good reporting because they figured out an independent press model to allow them to do local journalism, but it's not like a major newspaper corporation that's doing the good journalism. So long story short, I think that if, whether it's officially a nonprofit or a for-profit, have reasonable expectations that you will make almost no money in journalism and use the resources you have wisely. And as far as labor journalism goes, I think that actually is one of the places that could bring in the most money if done well, but it has to take into account the deunionization of America and the hostile environment towards unions. And so how do you reach people who are perhaps not a part of union movements, but who want to think differently about their fortunes? That's a structural question, because unions themselves have also been news outlets and produced news products. And so how do you, in a country that has an increasingly shrinking organized labor movement, how do you begin to re-envision labor news outside of the box of organized labor?
Could this election produce a kind of reinvigoration of the women's media, the alt media, that is sort of speaking to today's feminist community?
It's pretty vigorous already, isn't it? I mean, online, there's so much stuff. I spend hours every day going down the rabbit hole of feminist journalism on the web. And also I think that, that feminist issues are much better integrated into the news weekly magazines, which aren't doing so well themselves.
Which are your favorite feminist platform or women?
Oh, God, when people ask me these questions, I can never think of anything. Help me.
Rewire.
Rewire is
Rewire.
great. Let me talk about Rewire. Because
Used to be RH Reality Check.
Rewire is daily is a website devoted to reproductive rights, and it has a lot of news, a lot of information at a very high and complicated level. I learned so much from it all the time, and it's stuff that you just never see anywhere else. So they're really great. And I don't know how they stay in business. I think
Contributions.
yeah, contributions and grants and things like that. I think that in the old media is where there's, I don't know, why are there only 2 women columnists at the New York Times? I mean, that just always, they have a lot of women working there, and wouldn't be hard to think of lots of people who would be good.
Why are they comedians?
Yep.
Well, yeah.
Why do women always have to laugh?
Yeah. But you've got Rebecca Tracer at the New York New York Magazine doing brilliant coverage of the campaign, and she's a major voice. So I think there are important people. Erin Carmone, Michelle Goldberg. I mean, I'm mentioning all my friends, but so I think that feminist writing and feminist media is having a little renaissance. I think feminism is kind of having a moment of hotness now, and yeah, there it is, hot feminism. But labor journalism is really not. When Stephen Greenhouse left the Times,
Tragic.
he was not replaced. And if you look at the business section of the Times, it's all about high finance and big corporations. There's maybe there'll be one article about you and your job, but there really isn't a lot. It's as if we're all watching these colossuses of the economy do their dances, and there isn't very much written from the perspective of a working person. And just one more thing, have you noticed that NPR has a section on the news called Marketplace, but they don't have one called The Office or The Hiring Hall or something like that.
Yeah.
It's all from the perspective that what really matters is is high finance and big corporations.
There was a great quote from Phyllis Kriegel, who used to run New Directions for Women, who gave me my first ever writing assignment, I think. And she said, it's independent media that brings issues to the boil and mainstream that inhales the steam. And I think that continues to be true. So if any of you does not right now contribute to the independent media that you consume, that you rely on to build boiling steam, do it when you get home. Because to go back to Rinku's point, there's no way around it. Gloria Steinem also used to say, your values are where your money is. Your money reflects where your values are. So I don't see any way other than supporting independent
I
media.
think the reality is that that journalism requires subsidies. So at the best, you're going to get a narrow profit margin. It's not going to make the kinds of money that entertainment
Well, that used to be the
does.
principle before 1991.
Right. And so there are different ways we could think about subsidizing outlets, including, it seems to me, actual public funding of journalism. Along the lines of NPR. There are other problems. I mean, that has its own implications for independence and things like that. But, we used to have a publicly funded media system. And, so, I mean, one way or another, the public's going to have to pay for actual journalism, because unless we do, then billionaires are going to fund it all, and they're going to fund what they're interested in. So
The questioner raised the question of the BBC, which raises its money through rates that are charged on anyone that owns a television set. Now, I don't know what's happening
which
now
we
that
almost
people
had in the
don't need
US.
television sets anymore, but...
Yeah, we almost had that kind of fee in the U.S., and it was. I'm forgetting the whole backstory. Someone else will probably know it in the room, but basically it was during the Johnson era, and we narrowly missed having the funding mechanism for true public media.
And instead, we decided to leave it to Congress. All right, a few more questions on the gender question. Maureen Dowd says Hillary Rodham Clinton ran as a man in 2008 and is now running as a woman in 2016. How has she navigated her gender in her relationship with the media, and what are the long-term implications? And then related to that, accepting that sexism is the main factor, how could the media have presented a more nuanced perspective on Hillary Clinton as a DC business interest insider elite, as well as a woman?
I'm not going to say anything critical of Maureen Dowd.
Really?
I'm just going to reject that premise and move on. I think it is fair to say that in 2008 she was more concerned about being seen as presidential or commander-in-chief material, and I will say bad things about Mark Penn, who gave her terrible advice in that direction. But I think that the more we've gotten to know her this cycle, it's clear that the issues of women have been central to her career and her profession. And I think she's done a better job of promoting herself as a kind of movement candidate. Not entirely adequately, but she's had a sense that she needs to be seen as someone who will bring other women along. And I don't remember feeling that or sensing that as much in 2008. So there's definitely been an evolution in her understanding. But I think there's also, she's a politician, and I think that she's also responding to ferment in the culture and, the rise of Samantha Bee. I mean, I think we are having a moment. And so she can be more overtly feminist, and she can go on the set of Broad City, and there's a feminist network out there in entertainment as well as in politics that she can be a part of. And she knows enough to go to the mothers of the movement and bring them in and speak to their pain and not leave that pain outside of what she cares about. So I think she's run a really great feminist campaign this time around. And just, briefly on Maureen Dowd, it's very strange. She really likes to portray President Obama, Barry, as kind of effeminate, and Hillary is the man, and that goes back to 2008 too. So she's going to have to answer for herself.
There's another question. Katha said, I can't imagine how any woman could vote for Trump, but it seems, it seems some are. A lot are. Can we unpack that?
I would be happy to.
Go for it.
Go for it.
I've spent a lot of time interviewing Trump voters, and the two women who I spoke with who really stand out as examples are one who was in the piece we did on suburban white women, who are like the swing vote within the swing vote, and they've switched back and forth as a cohort between voting for Democrats and Republicans in recent elections. And I spoke to this woman who literally said, Trump is crazy, but then later decided to vote for him. But I wouldn't be surprised if she doesn't vote for him because it was right before the Trump tapes came out. And so she's someone who has no love for Clinton and who is conservative, but who's also very sensitive to the temperament question. And she really wants to vote for a conservative, and I get that, but she also knows he's, in her words, crazy. And these voters have been going back and forth. And another one is a woman who's a white evangelical Christian woman in South Carolina, and she really does not want the Supreme Court to become liberal. And I actually understand that. If that was my number one concern, I might vote for Trump, even though he is crazy. Now, personally, I don't think I would, but I'm trying to be empathetic here. If you really don't want the Supreme Court to change from what it was, 9 months ago, then you're in between a rock and a hard place, and a lot of these evangelical voters, it's not that they love Donald Trump. They are like crying on the way to the ballot box. So I think that we have to also really disaggregate who's voting for Trump because of racism, sexism, or because they really, really, really want to hold the line on the Supreme Court. So you have to understand women voters, like men voters, have very different agendas behind what will be just read as a vote. And finally, I do think that there are some women who are masking their point of view, at least to the men in their lives. So there was a survey that asked men and women who were in heterosexual marriages, who's your spouse going to vote for? And 10% of the men thought their spouse was voting for Trump when she was not. She was like, oh no. And so I'm sure there's a lot of yes-deering around certain kitchens and dining rooms, and when you go into the ballot box, you're alone.
Maybe the yes steering will make up for all the Trump voters who won't admit it on polls, like all the hidden Trump voters who know that.
I think there are probably more, actually.
I've been kind of cheered by the whole evangelical thing because they've told us for so long that their deeply held religious beliefs are what's required them to deny us reproductive rights and the pill and LGBTQ equality. And now we find out they're not deeply held at all. And they're happy to put them on a shelf. We've got about 10 more minutes, and a lot of the other questions have to do with topics that simply haven't made it into the election coverage at all. So one is around climate change. I think it does probably rise to the level of media malpractice, the degree to which this has or hasn't been covered. But the question here is, how can we pressure politicians to react or even acknowledge issues of environmental injustice and protection? I feel as if some of us are doing that, but the media sort of are not figuring out how to follow. Another one is, has the media played a negative role with their stories about the FBI director's new investigation into Hillary? And then the last one is about negative language around third parties. Why is voting for someone who actually represents you considered an act of protest?
If I can just take the Comey question.
Go for Comey.
I think
Climate, and the third parties.
I just think that, again, it's a prime example of media malpractice. People were going crazy on Friday afternoon, and they were taking their facts from a tweet from Jason Chaffetz, who is Mr. Oversight, Inspector Zealot, and New York Times reporters, really mainstream people who knew better, were letting his characterization of what the FBI had done drive their coverage, basically. And it took 3 or 4 hours to get a little bit more sobriety. But it continues to be called a bombshell, which it's only a bombshell because they called it a bombshell.
I think the Times today called it a jolt.
A jolt. I guess that's a little bit.
They must have gotten a critique.
Yeah. Bombshell is just cliche too. Jolt is better, more colorful. But the malpractice continues. There's really a struggle within the FBI. Comey doesn't have control of it, and something has been done to, somewhat damage, to harm the chances of our first female president. And I don't think reporters are yet sober enough. I mean, there's been a little bit more coverage of the incredible bipartisan outcry against Comey, which has been, has cheered me up. When you've got Alberto Gonzalez agreeing with Eric Holder, somebody did something wrong. But still, the breathless coverage every hour, at least on cable, but to some extent, the way it dominates the papers, is just terrible. And to kind of go back to a question that I think we skipped over, are people trying to create a horse race where there wasn't one? I don't know if it's conscious, but I think it's just built into the way we cover news, that you just can't let this go, that she's going to win by 10 points. I mean, I don't think that was ever true, but there is this need for tension, and the tension is really milked. And in this case, there is real tension, and what's wrong about it should get a lot more coverage than it does.
Well, that same day that story broke, the Washington Post investigation of Trump's donations also broke and was completely ignored. It had like 3 tweets or something. So there were actual competing investigative stories on Friday, and the non-story was the only one all weekend, and the actual story that was well reported, no attention.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say a word about the third-party question. I mean, people should do what they want, of course, but it would be better if they did what I want.
Always.
I have voted. I was just thinking. I have voted for many third-party candidates. I think I voted for Barry Commoner in, was it 1980? And he would have been good, great scientist. And I might have even voted for Ralph Nader in 2000 in safe New York, but I think at the last minute I pulled the lever for Al Gore. But and I understand why people do this, that you feel, you want to do what you feel is the right thing. But I think we have to resist that because I think politics it's just voting, not politics, which can be very complicated, but voting is not complicated. Voting is, it's on or it's off, and it's a very transactional, narrow thing, and the voting booth is not a confessional. It is not a place to purify yourself. It is just where you have to do the practical thing. And in this case, the practical thing is preventing Donald Trump and electing someone who I think is going to be pretty good. And when you look at Jill Stein and Gary Johnson, they wouldn't know the first thing about actually running the country. Gary Johnson would have to find out where Aleppo is and pretend to admire some world leaders and at least know who they are. And Jill Stein, her platform just makes no sense at all. And the most she has ever run is been a city council member in, her small town in Massachusetts, and I just don't think that's adequate preparation. So I hope that people will rethink their wish to do that.
I do think it would be great. I'm one of these people who really advocates for strategic third-party voting. But first of all, I always make a distinction between strategic third-party voting, which, for example, might be voting for Nader in New York versus voting for Nader in Ohio. It's like, pay attention to what the heck is going on. And if you don't want to be a strategic third-party voter and you want to be a, no matter what third-party voter, that is your choice. But some people don't even understand the distinction between being sort of a purist third-party voter and being a strategic voter. It's like, I will vote for a third party if it's not going to upset this apple cart. But just overall, I'm not a fan of the two-party system, and I think as America continues to become more diverse, not just racially, but ideologically and economically, I don't see how we're going to fit all of the interest in American politics into two buckets and do it successfully. And right now what you have is that you have essentially the alt-right and the retro-right wing of the Republican Party and the establishment Republican Party all having to fit into one Republican Party, and it's not pretty. And I don't know who's going to be the Republican Party on November 9th. Like, who is going to be the Republican Party? Is it going to be Breitbart? Is it going to be Paul Ryan? Is it going to, who's even going to be the party? So this is a structural problem, which unfortunately would require, I don't know that we can, I don't know that we have the will to remake America as a multi-party democracy. I highly doubt it. But this is going to continue to cause problems for a long time.
It goes back, in a sense, to what Rinku said about the media's disinclination to cover movements. And I think that has plagued the Green Party, too, that they have failed to really do the work in between elections, at least the work that gets covered. And that's what we're going to need. We're going to need consistent in-between election kind of work. And just one last thing that I was moved by listening to Democracy Now! This morning, where they had the woman from the Pirate Party in Iceland say that it was a women's party that was created in the 70s, cross-sectarian, cross-party membership, women's party that called for accountability and transparency, that inspired the Pirate Party. And I thought, these stories, we need these stories that this is possible to change a party structure. She also called on us, by the way, to simplify our system and to make our elections shorter, which I think is a consensus view.
Oh, that's,
Agreed.
I'll be for that.
I just wanted to make one point, though, which is that, I think that we really may see the Republican Party experiment with evolving into forming a third party, because I don't know that there's room in the party for, Steve Bannon, and I'm not going to give Paul Ryan any credit as like some kind of serious person with a moral compass, but Mitt Romney, I don't know, that somehow he's better to me. So there's that could happen, but I just don't want people to miss the extent to which women and African Americans and Latinos and gay people have taken over the Democratic Party. And the influence of the Sanders folks on the campaign was extraordinary. So, people, this is our party now. There still are corporatists, there still are lobbyists, there still are people that we have to fight. There's going to be a real need to hold Secretary Clinton's feet to the fire around her appointments and make sure she doesn't fill offices with Wall Street folks. There's a risk of that. I'm not saying she's perfect, but we do have more of an infrastructure to make those things happen. So people shouldn't be despairing about it.
Ooh, well, I think that's the question for our next panel. Is this our party now? I think could be a good discussion. I think we would have some debate. We'll find out, I guess, as the years go by. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, everybody on the panel.